I hope everyone had a good lunch. We're going to go ahead and start our afternoon panel. It's been a great start. Had really great conversations with everybody. It sounds like the secretaries left us with a lot to think about this morning about what California's future elections may look like. And I've heard from various folks that breakout sessions were great conversations as well. We learned about civic engagement and designing for the voter. And now I was particularly excited about this panel because not only is it a panel for election geeks, it's also a panel for data geeks. So research is a really important part to the work of future of California elections, and research has always been a component that we consider because it informs our policy making. Research can inform our policy implementation, and research can also inform our policy analysis. How well are the reforms achieving what we want them to achieve? And so that's exactly what our panel is going to teach us today. They are doing great work on current policies and future policies, and we're going to hear from each of them. So let me introduce our panel. We have Mindy Romero, founding director of the California Civic Engagement Project. It's a state resource for civic engagement research housed at the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. We have Eric McGee, research fellow, Public Policy Institute of California. His research focuses on elections, legislative behavior, political reform, surveys, and polling. And Leela Peterson, program manager for California Common Cause. And we are sad to say for us, but happy for Leela, that she's going to be transitioning to a new position at New America next week. But thank you for joining us today, Leela. So Mindy's going to start off our conversation. She's going to give us an overview about online voter registration. We heard this morning from Secretary Williams that online voter registration saves money. And California's had it now since 2012, and so Mindy's done some great work. We're going to see how that policy is doing across California. And then we're going to continue the conversation to look at a policy implementation. And we heard Secretary Padilla talk about automatic voter registration, or California's new motor voter law. And Eric has been doing some research and looking at what the implications for implementation are of California's new motor voter law. And then we are going to transition our conversation to voting models. And we heard Colorado Secretary Williams talk to us about what Colorado's doing. And Leela's done some research looking at the numbers of what the impact of vote center models are for Colorado. And complementary to that, Mindy's going to talk to us about the voting preferences for California voters. And so I think without further ado, we have a great panel ahead, and I'll pass it over to Mindy.
Thank you, Astrid. So, good afternoon. How is everyone? Good. Okay. So this is part one of my presentation, and I'm going to go rather quickly because I have a lot to share with you. So jumping in, we are conducting currently a study on online voter registration. It's a follow-up to our work a couple of years ago. It's a follow-up to our work a couple of years ago, looking at online voter registration and the early impacts. Thank you. Is that on? Can people hear me better? There we go. Okay. So we have multiple research questions for today. I'm going to cover who uses OVR currently, and how does that population compare to the non-online, those not using OVR? So multiple methods using data from the Secretary of State's office, from Political Data Incorporated, Paul's here, and income data that you hear me talk about today is from the American Community Survey. So in a summary, thus far, there have been about almost 2.3 million actually completed applications, online voter registration applications in California. As of very recently, this last week or so, February 2016, if you look at the actual voter registration, voter file or voter registration records in California by county, they total up to, for the state, about 1.1 million, almost 1.2 million that are on record as having currently their last registration being online. That makes sense? So that 2.3 million, some of those people have registered again through the online system. And some folks have, when they've re-registered, they've registered paper-wise, and we can talk about my Q&A if you'd like. That means about 6.9% of all folks that are registered in the state of California to vote have currently on record as being registered through the online system. And what really matters is really once it was implemented, right? Once it was an option, how many voters have chosen that? And currently on record, we have about 25% having done that. Over the last few years, there's 2012, and as you may recall, again, that was September 2012 that it was implemented. So very heavy use of online voter registration initially right after its implementation in 2012. Much lower in 2013, 2014, 2015. And just really briefly, I want to highlight 2015. Less than 2 months, we see just a little over 200,000 completed applications through OVR. Here I want to emphasize that there is a great deal of variation across the state by county in terms of the percent of their registrants or registered voter population that are on record as having registered via the online system. But if we don't look at county and we look at, and you could ignore for today the crosshatch there, that's income. But if we look at the colored areas, we can see these are all by census block groups. The darker the shade, the higher the percentage of that census block that actually used OVR, the registrants there that used OVR. And in short, you can see that we've got our urban areas in the Bay Area and in LA, and if I had time, I would zoom in, and it's quite fascinating. But the urban areas are the ones that are having the much higher OVR use rates, at least in terms of proportions of their registrants. Breaking it out by age, if you can see in the back, each of these groupings are 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and so on. The blue is the percent of all those that are registered online, that pie of online registrants, compared to the pie of non-online registrants. And this is, again, those that could registered non-online, if you will, after the implementation. So we're comparing apples to apples. And what you may notice is, if we look at the blue, we see that the use proportion of the pie of online registrants is a larger proportion than non-online, right? So about 50% are under age 34 or under age 35. But what might be surprising, if you look at those 18 to 24-year-olds, they actually make up a smaller percentage of online voters versus non-online. And that's very different than when online voter registration was first implemented those first few months. We saw 30% of all online registrants were age 18 to 24. Yeah, and I think I'll leave it there because of time. So just looking at a few other groups that are of interest, I think, to many here. If we look at Latinos, they make up a smaller proportion of the online pie. Asian Americans, flipped a little bit, slightly more, a couple percentage points more, or a little bit over 1 percentage point. Foreign born, less. US born, a little bit more, right, obviously. But we see a difference, but it's not a huge cavernous gap either. And for those folks that were concerned about young people not using the system, or Latinos, others like that, not using the system. Just a few quick slides. So income also was a question mark. Would those folks that are lower income, those lower income communities, be able to access and use OVR? And so as of now today, just a few years later, we see, if we look at these categories, 0 to 40, 40 to 75, this is medium income by census block group, and the registrants that live in those census blocks, you can see that there are differences, but they're very similar in terms of the age distributions. And in summary, there's variation by county. Urban use much higher, young using it more, but not the 18 to 24-year-olds as much. Latinos and foreign born using it a little bit less, and low-income people, or those in low-income communities, I should say, using it nearly at the same rates, but certainly improvement can be made. And that's it. Thank you.
And we're going to continue to our next presentation. So if you have questions, write them down. We'll kind of come back to Q&A at the end of the presentations.
Cool. Thanks. So this is actually a project that you see Mindy's name on this too. Mindy and I are actually working on this together. It's an effort to give some sense of what the context is for sort of the expectations we might have for the new automated voter registration system, AB 1461. For those of you who might not be aware, I'm sure there's very few of you in this room who are not aware, but for those of you who are not aware, AB 1461, it's often called automatic voter registration, but at its core, what it really does is it strengthens the link between the DMV and the Secretary of State. Anybody who comes to the DMV in the future who attests to being eligible to vote will be registered by default. And then that information will be transmitted electronically to the Secretary of State. This applies to new driver's licenses, to address updates, and probably, as it's looking right now, to renewals as well, even though the law doesn't specifically mandate that. So the key questions as we're sort of contemplating this change is, number one, how much could we see a change in the California electorate if this thing worked like gangbusters? Second, how fast could we get to that goal? How fast could new people be added to the registration rolls? And then third, how many who are given the opportunity to sign up likely will sign up, right? So just taking that first question first, how much, if this thing just worked as it's very aspirational, if it worked as well as we could possibly hope, and we just registered everybody who's currently unregistered, that's probably not what's likely to happen, but let's set that as a goal. How much could we see a change in the electorate? And that actually breaks down into a series of sub-questions. One is, how different are registered voters from the population of eligible residents who are unregistered on a variety of demographics? If we were to register all of those eligible unregistered, how different would the resulting pool of potential voters be on those demographics? And then how much closer would that get us to the, what is kind of the ultimate goal of trying to represent the whole population of California, of all adults, which includes, of course, also non-citizens and felons. So here is just the R's there are the share of registered voters who fall in each group. Now, these groups are not mutually exclusive. They overlap quite a bit. But we've got the poor, people who recently moved, the young, Asian Americans, Latinos, those with a high school education or less, and those with 2 foreign-born parents. And so you can see that the share of the registered voters that fall in each of those categories varies quite a bit. It's highest for foreign-born parentage, but nonetheless, there's a decent share in each of these categories. This now adds in, well, this is the same numbers for the unregistered population. You can see there is actually quite a big difference between the two groups. This is not necessarily a big surprise, but you can see that the unregistered population is much more likely to be poor, have recently moved, be young, and especially when you get down to these categories at the bottom, to have foreign-born parents, to be less educated. These are common features of the unregistered population, much more so than the registered. Now, if we combine the two together, because there's more registered voters than unregistered eligible, the result ends up a little closer to the registered number, but you see that there can be some significant shifts in each case, especially, again, down as we get down to these larger groups down below. We see a pretty significant change in the composition of the population if we were to get all those unregistered people registered. And then this just gives us the broader sense of context. What does the adult population, all adult population look like? And in every case, the eligible population, not surprisingly, is closer to that all adult population. What's kind of surprising to me and interesting to me is that even moving to the eligible population, we still got a long ways to go on some of these demographic categories: Latinos, education, and especially foreign-born parents. So the adult population is much higher in those categories than is even the eligible population. So how fast could we add these new registrants? Remember, the law doesn't apply to just everybody. It's not like Oregon's law. Oregon's law, if you were here for the session in the morning, the Oregon Secretary of State said that they're going to eventually, after the primary, reach back and start pulling people going 2 years back from the DMV list. And we're not going to do that here. We're only going to take people moving forward. So how fast could they be added? Well, that's a question of the sort of churn that we have in the DMV, if you will. How many people are going to the DMV to get driver's licenses, new driver's licenses, to change their address and to renew? So that we're still, Mindy and I are still working through all of the numbers, but to just give you a ballpark of the magnitude we're talking about, how many people get a new driver's license each year? Around 800, 900,000 people. How many change their address? About 2.5 million. How many renew their driver's license? About 5 million. So these are big numbers, right? For context, 17 to 18 million for the registration rules currently. But a key question is how many of these people who are coming to the DMV for these transactions, how many are already registered to vote, right? A large number will be, there's no doubt. So if we're talking about adding to the registration rules, we need to think like, so what's a plausible number? And again, Minnie and I are working this through right now, but one possibility is it's just they're registered at the same rate as the rest of the population. That would be 70 to 80%, somewhere around there. That would cut down on these numbers quite a bit, but they would still be fairly large. But that's probably not a realistic expectation because people who get a new driver's license are disproportionately very young. And people who are getting an address change, by definition, have recently moved. And those are both categories of people, as we just saw, who are much less likely to be registered in the first place. So I think the potential number of people who are already registered is likely a great deal lower than 70 to 80%. So the final question is how many of these people who can sign up, they go to the DMV, they get the opportunity put in front of them, how many will sign up? And that's it comes down to the kind of the nitty-gritty of the way the law is written. To register through AB 1461, the information passed to the Secretary of State has to show that you attested to being eligible, or you won't be registered. But you don't have to necessarily give an answer to the registration question. That's how this is a sort of default registration system. So that registration is optional. If you can of course say you don't want to be registered and you won't be, but if you say nothing, you'll be registered as long as you attest to being eligible. So this is, if you think about it, this is like an opt-in versus opt-out kind of situation. The attestation is like an opt-in, whereas the registration is opt-out. Research has shown repeatedly that opt-in versus opt-out can have extraordinarily powerful effects on participation rates in programs. So to the extent that people are opting out of something and they're put in by default and then they have to actively opt out, they're much more likely to participate, even if that option is made very salient to them. So then the key considerations moving forward for knowing how many people are going to sign up, one, and I think most critically, is how hard will it be to avoid the eligibility question? If you have to answer the eligibility question in order to complete your transaction with the DMV, then the likelihood of big registration numbers, I think, is pretty good. If it's easy to avoid that eligibility question, then it's not going to be as good because you got to opt in that sense. And that's it for now. I'm happy to. Again, this is part of a broader sort of research agenda that Mindy and I have put together on this new law. And I'd be happy to talk to people about sort of our aspirations for what we'd like to do in the Q&A if they want. Okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone. I am honored to be on this panel today because in my current position at Common Cause, I'm not a researcher, but I'm an organizer and a policy analyst by training. And as the secretaries, so eloquently told us this morning, California is looking to other states as a model for how we might adopt the election administration changes that other states have seen to be successful in terms of engaging a broader portion of the electorate. And so the report that I put together is a qualitative analysis, and I conducted a series of interviews with Colorado election officials, advocates, and others to talk about how the Colorado system works and how that might inform the way that California moves forward with SB 450. And so as an organizer, the question that keeps me up at night, as I'm sure many of you, is how do we increase civic participation? How do we engage those people who are eligible to vote, but for whatever reason do not cast a ballot on election day? And if you look at the trends, as was told to us this morning, voter participation is on a severe decline. In 2014, the midterm election, 42% of the registered voters actually turned out to vote. That doesn't even count all of the almost 7 million people who are eligible but unregistered. And so if you look across counties and across the 58 counties in California, you'll also see wide variation from county to county, where in Sierra County they had 73% of their registered voters turn out in 2014, but in Los Angeles only 31%. And so what are the reasons for why people either decide to vote or not? And thanks to the research from PPIC, we have a little bit better insight into some of those reasons. And the greatest reason, as many of you who do this work on a daily basis probably know, 36% of people who don't vote say it's because they're just not interested. They're apathetic, they're not interested in participating. It's not something that's in their daily, psyche. 32%, the next largest share, say that it's because of timing or scheduling. So they're busy. They have 3 jobs. They have to put food on the table, and they just don't have time to think about, how am I going to receive my ballot? Where am I going to drop it off? Much less who's actually running and what issues do I support. The next proportion, 10%, they lack confidence in the system. That's related, I think, to apathy. 9%, it's process related. And then 12% is just other. So if you combine the timing and scheduling with sort of the process related, that's 40% of people who aren't voting that an election administration fix could make the difference in terms of turning them from a registered voter or even an unregistered voter to an active participating voter. And so states have sort of looked at different opportunities and experimented in different ways with how we might solve these, more process election administration fixes to increasing participation. One such state that this report that I've distributed amongst the tables looks at is Colorado. As you heard this morning, they have a ballot delivery system where every single registered active voter receives a ballot by mail. It's then up to them how they want to return that ballot. And so in our interviews, we asked questions of election officials about, how has this process worked for you? Do voters like this system? Are there any complications that you've come across that California should really look at and be thinking about as we start to look at this model and adapt it for our own state? And thankfully, Secretary Williams did a lot of the explaining about how 1303 works, and so I can skip some of that preamble, but as you get into the report, we did come up with a series of recommendations, again, based on the interviews that I conducted and the conversations that I had with election officials and advocates. These were sort of the top 5 things that really came up that said, okay, the system works great, but these are the top 5 things that you might consider and really look at as you're crafting SB 450. So the first is just that Colorado was in a much different place when they adopted 1303 than California currently is as they're considering SB 450. So vote by mail had already been in place for about 25 years. People were very used to that all mail or mail ballot system. And vote centers actually had been experimented with in different counties since 2003. And so there was a sense from voters in different counties if that county elected to experiment with those models, voters were familiar with receiving their ballot by mail. They were familiar with what a vote center was, and they had started that transition from the traditional, polling place, precinct-based model to this more mail ballot and vote center model. And so as California moves into potentially adopting this model, we might consider a phased-in approach, whereby counties that already have a high vote by mail usage rate, maybe those are the first ones to adopt this model because voters are already, they already have behavior that the reform would match voters' current behavior. There's also a lot of sort of technology differences. Colorado obviously already had their statewide voter database in place. California is currently rolling that out. And in a lot of the conversations with election officials, one of the main reasons why their system is so effective is because they have very clean lists. They engage in national change of address. They are a participant in ERIC, and they have really good lists so that when they're mailing ballots out, there are very few people who are on that list who are not actually living where their address indicates. The second recommendation is just that the in-person option is so important. And I think a lot of people in this room have recognized that, especially for a county like Los Angeles, where we not only have such low voter participation, but we also have an enormous amount of people who are unregistered. And so as same-day registration comes online, we need to have vote centers with capacity enough to service all of those people who decide that they want to start voting and are already registered, but also all of those people who come to vote centers to register for the first time and want to vote on the same day. The third recommendation is about early voting, and it's very interesting. The 71% of people who choose to vote in person actually vote on that Monday and Tuesday, so the day before and on election day. There's some quotes in the report, and you'll see the first week of early voting, dismal. I mean, some of these counties said that they had about 5 people come in the first week. And it's important to put this in context because, again, as we heard this morning, only 5% of people in Colorado are choosing to vote in person. So this is really playing with the margins, at least in Colorado. But for those 5%, that Monday before Election Day and Election Day are really the most critical. And so we would encourage both the state and counties to focus their resources on those 2 days. So potentially opening a couple of options for early voting in the 2 weeks prior, but really having the vast majority of vote centers open up on that Monday and Tuesday. The fourth recommendation is that jurisdictions with low vote by mail and high eligible but unregistered populations, again, should plan for additional capacity. So this is what I talked about LA. So not only additional vote centers, but each vote center should have enough terminals and enough staff to service all the people that will cycle through. And the last recommendation is that over time, as counties start to experiment with this model, the goal should be to have everyone working towards a more consistent system across the state. So initially, upon implementation, we might have an increase in inconsistency because counties are starting to experiment and test out what works and what doesn't. But over time, what really makes the Colorado model work is that if a voter moves from Denver County to Boulder County, they shouldn't have to relearn an entirely new election administration system. They shouldn't have to, if they're being mailed a ballot in one county, when they move, they should also be mailed a ballot in that county so that you don't have to start over that education and outreach piece. So over time, we're hoping that we can move to a more consistent model in order to decrease voter confusion and improve the voter experience for all. So just lastly, I'll just conclude by saying some of the data points that I think are very compelling is that 95% of people who were surveyed in Colorado said that they were either satisfied or very satisfied with the current election system. 95%. That's huge. If 95% of people in California said that they loved the way that we do election systems, I think that we would have a much higher turnout. And so this model should really be looked at. As I've said, California is very different, but I think that there are a lot of things to learn from Colorado and the way that they administer elections in order to improve the voter experience and ultimately increase turnout. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back. Oh, but I'm going to need tech support. One-minute intermission.
Oh, you don't know how bad I am at this.
Better than me, I'm sure. Okay, so another study that we're currently conducting with a number of partners, and I'll name them today, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and NALEO, and Greenlining, and the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers. Many folks have come together to work with us to examine what we're calling the California voter experience. It's a very large study looking at a rather dense set of research questions, but today I'm going to talk about two briefly here. So why choose vote by mail versus the polls? So many of you know that we conducted, the California Civic Engagement Project conducted research about a year or so ago looking at vote by mail use in California. And a big question for us and many of you that came out of that work was the why question. There are disparities in vote by mail use, particularly Latinos and younger voters are not using vote by mail in as large numbers or percentages than as other groups or the general electorate. Why is that the case? And then we also asked, as we asked about ballot voter experience and ballot choice, we asked about this potential choice of the vote center model and gained some reactions from our respondents on that. So this is a mixed method study. Focus groups across the state, about 15, targeted surveys, and also a statewide representative survey. Today I'm going to talk to you and give you some responses from our focus groups. So speaking with voters with disabilities, young people, Latinos, Asian Americans, both English dominant, English speaking, LEP Latino, Spanish, Korean language, Vietnamese, and Chinese language focus groups as well. And across multiple geographies, LA, the Central Valley, San Francisco, and of course that rural-urban mix. Okay, so getting to the question, why choose vote by mail? Why choose polling places? So in my short amount of time, and happy to talk more in the Q&A certainly, I'm going to give you some shared kind of commonalities. These are some, not all, that we experienced. Under vote by mail, those that chose vote by mail, or at least that's their dominant or typical choice, they talked about convenience and time allocation. They talked about wanting to take their time with their ballot and being able to think through and use their resources and research at home with their materials and have them with them as they make their choice. A lot of discussion around wanting to avoid the lines when we talked about polling places. They want to avoid the wait, they want to avoid the lines, particularly in the San Francisco and Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area and LA area. Polls, again, this is a shared responses across groups. Talked about, those poll voters talked about the social aspect of voting, the connecting, seeing friends, seeing poll workers that they've know and have familiarity with over the years, or at least in their neighborhood. Many expressed that this is what voting is about. Pulling a lever or punching a ballot, that's what voting is, and that's their preferred method, and that's how they want to experience voting. They feel like they've voted if they vote at a polling place. And that they're more likely if it's near. So folks talked about, yeah, it's down my block, it's across the street. Well, of course I'm going to go vote by mail, it's right there. Some of those talked about it being something that reminded them. I drive by my local school, I see the sign, I'm pulled in, it reminds me to vote. I wait to see that, I know where it is, it's always there. And across the board, wanting that sticker. And by the way, a lot of vote by mail folks talked about wanting that sticker, and no matter how connected they were to vote by mail, many said, but I'm not getting that sticker. But polling place folks talked with pride about having that sticker and going out and showing it all day. Some people talked about the goodies or freebies they would get. In LA, Dean may like this, some of my LA folks that we spoke with talked about the vote by mail sticker in multiple languages, and that being something that was highly meaningful for them and very something that they were proud of, an additional component to voting in their community with its diversity. Some group differences, and again, these are just some for time, but Latinos talked about work hours, those choosing vote by mail because of their work hours, swing shifts, odd times of responsibilities, family responsibilities that made going to the polls inconvenient. They talked about wanting to take their time with their ballot, but specifically really emphasizing more even about doing it with their family, doing it at the table and discussing it. These are those that were vote by mail. Those that chose polls or typically chose polls, voters with disabilities that we spoke with, they talked about wanting to be seen, or many talked about wanting to be seen representing the disabled community. That was really important to them. Showing that they were participating, making a statement, maybe proving some folks wrong or surprising folks. Wanting to cast a ballot in private using the voting accessible machine. Young people, we heard many times about young people talking about at least that first experience being at the polling place. I wanted that first experience to be at the polling place, and then maybe it deviated or didn't deviate after that. But to them, voting for the first time meant going down to the polling place. Some talked about their parents taking them, or they remembered their parents doing it, but whatever the reason, that was a connection for them. And then Latinos as well, many folks talked about the social aspect, but for the Latino community that we talked to, particularly the LAP community, talked about the social aspect and the community that they experienced in doing that. Reactions to vote center models. So again, forgive the quickness here. We asked folks, we described the potential, many of the potentials around the vote center model that's being discussed here in California, and we wanted to get their reactions and their thoughts. So some shared responses across groups were a positive reaction to the idea of early voting and having more time. And even if they didn't necessarily use it, some thought they might, they thought that this was a positive for voters. How could it not be having more time? Some were concerned about a bureaucratic feel. Many just assumed there would be more of a bureaucratic feel. So we got comments like, is it going to be like the DMV? Is it going to be like the Social Security office? Is it going to be like the welfare office? And more Latinos and Asian Americans talked about that. Many folks across the board talked about crowds, and they said, the vote center is going to mean there's more crowds? I don't want crowds. Parking was absolutely huge. Whether they had initial positive reaction or initial negative reaction, again, I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but we had suggestion after suggestion. There better be parking, it better be accessible, and if there wasn't, that would inhibit their use of the vote center. Some did talk about thinking that they might still procrastinate. So even though they like the idea of the early voting models, it's kind of consistent with what Leila experienced in her interviews for Colorado. Yeah, it's great, but I'm not quite sure. I might end up still dropping my ballot off if I drop my ballot off at the last minute or voting at the last minute. For some folks, the dropping off is if you drop off your ballot, it's a last minute thing because of time or you forgot. Other folks, we were surprised by the number of folks that talked about it being sometimes even a strategy. They wanted to wait till they got more information or more candidates were vetted or just give it a little more time in case something else comes out in the election. And distance concerns. So this also was across the board. Even folks that, again, initial positive reactions or initial negative reactions, we just said, you think you might use it in some way, and let's talk about the distance, right, the location. And a majority of folks said, even when they had a positive reaction and said they might use it at some point, even their vote by mail person, they might use it for materials or resources. When it came down to time, they gave a very short amount of time. Most people said time, not distance. Some people said distance, but you could translate it into time, but it was very short. And we clarified, you're saying this would be the threshold You're open to using it. You said even the folks that were very positive about it, but what is the farthest you'd be willing to go to use it? 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 blocks. And I'll talk about some of the differences within that. We did have a lot of 20 minutes, but beyond that, it was pretty rare to get past 20 minutes. LA voters, some group differences. So there was heightened concern over distance and travel time. When we talked about the possibility about being along high traffic or commute routes, that was a negative. We got a pretty strong reaction from a lot of people about that. And just the difficulty getting around to LA and how if they have to travel further, that might be prohibitive, right? Or they might turn to vote by mail. San Francisco voters, a lot of talk about transportation routes. If you know San Francisco, right, very elaborate public transportation system. There's a lot of discussion in the Central Valley about the rural voters and the lack of transportation. We did have an in-depth focus group in very rural eastern Fresno, actually Kings County, with Spanish only voters. And it was pretty darn cool, but that's a side note. We were surprised, and many of them were, we had a mixture of folks, but even the diehard voters, that when presented with the possibility of having to go to another town, even the next town not that far away, that was something that they really balked at. They said, not in my town, even though their town was very small. We had a mixture of folks from different communities, but and they really balked. Not outside of my town, it was almost, for some of them, offensive to think about doing that. And also within that group, they talked about, many of them liked the idea of more time, the people that were positive to the more time, the early voting, but they also said distance matters more than having more time. And it made a really strong point about that. So I wanted to highlight that. Young people and Latinos talked about the feel of vote centers. I'm going a little bit over time, but forgive me. The feel of vote centers, that was important. The atmosphere. We got suggestions on how it should look and how it should feel. I'm being a bit more casual here, but snacks, decorations, coffee, welcoming, particularly for Latinos and Asian Americans also as well, the welcoming aspect. Latinos as a whole generally had more negative reactions, particularly Latino LEP, Spanish speaking. They had more questions. They were a bit more concerned at the outset, just initially, even before further conversation, and throughout, even with more explanation, they were more concerned. Asian Americans had more mixed reactions. And LEP, in general, a little more generally, again, distance concerns, and we heard from some Latino LEP, Spanish speaking, that were wondering and questioning why is this being done? Why is this almost a distrust of the change and perhaps of the system? And within that, as we talked, trust and confidence was a big theme throughout the discussion of why they choose the ballots that they choose, and I'd be happy to talk about this in the Q&A, and even in how it was kind of a common thread in how they viewed the vote center model. Older voters, concerns about distance. I vote downstairs. What does this mean? I can't go downstairs anymore. What am I going to do? What are my colleagues going to do? Some other older voters, my son takes me and drives me. I'm sure he still will, but I'm not quite sure if he will. And other people very confident that they had the ride, they were good to go. But that was a concern that came up, particularly for older voters. And finally, some closing thoughts. So understanding how different voter groups might receive this change, we think is really critical. Some can be confused, can be fearful, can be just plain turned off by change. Understanding the reasoning behind it and trusting the reasons behind it, we think are pretty important. And of course, all of that, the common thread is education is absolutely critical in how it's received and how people are willing to learn more about it and potentially use it. Thank you very much.
So thank you to all of our panelists. Definitely gives us the visuals and the numbers that all of us have been sensing that have been working on elections, and really hearing the various topics that we heard, from online voter registration to implications for the new motor voter law to the flexible voting options here for California. So I'd love to open it up for questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. We have a volunteer here with a microphone somewhere? A volunteer with a microphone? Okay, well, the volunteer gets the mic. I get to have a mic already, so I'll go ahead and ask a question. So just for all of you, given your expertise in California demographics and in elections, what are some of the issues that we really need to be aware of for effective and successful policy implication? You know, Mindy, you saw that with online voter registration. Eric, you're thinking about that with the new motor voter law. And Leela, you've seen Colorado's model, but all of you are Californians. So for California, what are the big things that we need to be looking at when we look at new reforms?
Well, that's a pretty big question. First of all, I just wanted to, one thing I forgot to mention in the presentation, it was on the slide, but the research that Mindy and I are doing together is funded by the Irvine Foundation, and we want to thank them for that help. In terms of what we should be thinking about for reforms, I mean, I think one theme that kind of comes out from all of this is it's got to be as simple as possible. It's got to be something that makes the voting experience as sort of in the details of it as much in the background as possible. And then I think that's something that Mindy and I have always tried to emphasize in our work is that even once you implement reforms to make it easier to vote, to put more people in the registration rolls, that there's always going to be a mobilization step after that. And what these reforms are really about is trying to remove as much of that other baggage as possible, so that efforts can be focused entirely on mobilization and drawing people to the polls. So,
well said. I think the only thing I would add there is, again, if you're thinking about reforms, certainly the follow-through is absolutely critical. But as we're developing reforms, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. So I think if there's a common theme through all of our work, and many of the work I think that amongst the group here is understanding the diversity of experiences, the great degree of disparity. Everyone participates in low numbers in California, much lower than what we'd want to see, but there's great disparity within the electorate. And really having, not giving lip service to that understanding, but to actively and aggressively put that thinking to use as we're developing reforms, and then as we're testing them and tracking them and having honest conversations about what is acceptable in terms of the improvement levels, and not creating reforms that may, I would suggest, some folks look at it this way, creating reforms that will increase the number of voters in California, that's great, but what if we end up in creating, and not suggesting that's the case with anything that we've talked about today, but in general, creating reforms that end up creating greater disparities. So it's not just that total number, but it's have really a critical eye in it, an honest conversation about not creating additional disparities.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that by saying, in talking to Colorado election officials, Colorado is very different from California in many ways. We have a different election administration system, a different history, but we also have very different demographics. Demographics just in sheer numbers. I mean, there's 2 million people that voted in the entire state in 2012. I mean, that's LA County sees more than that. And so just sheer numbers. And in talking to election officials about when 1303 was implemented and vote center model came online, I asked them, what did you do in terms to educate voters, and how did you reach out to them to let them know that the system was going to be changing? And I was shocked by the number of people that said, oh, they didn't do anything extraordinary to what they normally do. They said, oh, I just, talked about it in my speeches when I go to different town halls, and they didn't do anything. A lot of people didn't do anything extra. That's not to say that no one did, but California is going to be, if 450 is implemented, it's going to be making a much larger leap in terms of the system changes, and so the education outreach needs to match that the magnitude of change.
Great, thank you. And 450, for those that are not following election bills in California, it's SB 450, and it's a bill being carried by Senator Ben Allen, and he'll be here tomorrow for our closing plenary, so we can hope to hear from him then. So I'd love to open it up now for Q&A. We have Rosalind, and then Halika, and 3. 1, 2, 3. And then we have a mic coming. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to quickly thank the entire panel. This was a wonderful presentation, and for those of us who either do advocacy or work in the community, it's really good to know that this research is ongoing, because that really informs the work that we do and some of the policy decisions and the way that we think about this moving forward. Mindy, I had 2 quick questions for you. So first of all, in terms of online voter registration, I think your data about who is using online voter registration, and I think that when online voter registration was first being digital divide, we'd see really big differences between who's using online voter registration and who isn't. And it looks like there's some, but they're not, if I'm correct. But here's the other question I wanted to ask. Do we have a way eventually to really gauge whether online voter registration will actually increase the number of people who register? In other words, are the people who are using online voter registration the people who would be registering to vote anyway, but they now have a more accessible way to do it? Or will we maybe over several years, or using the experiences of other states, be able to get a sense of, is it actually having an impact on increasing registration? And then the second question has to do with your vote center. Again, real quickly, one of the sort of anecdotal things we hear out there about why certain folks don't use vote by mail is they're concerned about the mail and trust in the mail. And did that come up in the focus groups?
Great. I think I'll take those in reverse. Second first. Yes, the question of the mail. So for time and simplicity, I just talked about why people choose vote by mail versus polling place, but we also know there's this other major third option where people use vote by mail, but they choose to drop it off. And in 2012, it was almost a quarter of vote by mail users that chose to drop it off. And I think for both, for polling place folks and for vote by mail, but dropping it off, that did come up, and it came up actually a little bit more intensely for Latino LEP, but we did hear it a little more broadly. We asked the question, trying to flesh out why they are not choosing to mail it, especially if they have a ballot. But Latinos particularly talked about, worried about it getting there safely. Some folks actually would take it to the post office, but they felt like going to the post office was at least a little bit better than putting it in their local mailing box. It was removing one step. I know it made it there safe. And I think when I mentioned earlier that kind of current of trust and confidence, I think that's kind of caught up in there. There was I think, particularly for Latino LEP, but I think even Latinos more broadly, there was more of the reactions that we got around polling places, choosing to vote, to use polling places, but particularly also around the vote center model. There was this question of why is this change? Why is the system doing this? How is this going? Almost a defensive reaction in some ways. What is this going to mean for our community? Even if I think I'm going to be fine, it's not going to affect me, I'm going to vote the same way. A real concern and a lot of conversation around fellow Latinos, right? And wondering, almost to the level of some suspicion by some folks, but certainly a lot of questions. We got a lot of questions about why, and more questions than we did for some other groups. Less of a kind of a, well, this is a change, let's figure out how to do it. Why is there this change? More about why is there this change? If that makes sense, does that answer that question for you? And then your other question, I think it's a methodology question, really. So if you're looking just straight at the numbers, so the OVR and how can we figure out if it's actually increasing registration. You're right, the big thing is how do we know these folks didn't, like particularly in 2012, that was a big caveat to our work, looking at November 2012's election. We saw a lot of use around OVR. We saw and increases in registration, and in some groups some turnout increases, but a big caveat was we don't know for sure that those folks, right, would not have. And I think very much in 2012 too, the context in which those folks were being registered mattered. There's a lot of work, to be honest with you, a lot of work around Proposition 30, particularly for young people, right? So they're being registered. If you get registered around election time, that tends to increase the likelihood, particularly at least in California, that you're going to actually vote because you're registering to vote. But getting registered around a political movement, basically, was what was happening. And you're being targeted and you're being told not just to register to vote, but vote for a reason and something that's going to be important and salient to you, right? That stands to reason that's going to increase your turnout and also motivate more people to sign up. Going forward, I think it's a different type of methodology. Here we're doing a descriptive look. We are going to be conducting some regression analysis, looking at some of the kind of dissecting, and we are actually doing it now, but dissecting the registered voter population and looking at some causal questions. Which will get a little bit about what you're asking, but I think to really know some of that, you could use things like experiments and other kinds of methodologies, yeah. But it's an important question, and certainly over time, looking at trends as we develop, over time, we tend to see a boost, and there is a higher turnout rate for younger folks that so many things I couldn't touch on in the time we had, but. So some of you may remember that one of the findings that we had out of 2012 was there were much higher turnout rates, registered voter turnout rates for online folks. Again, there was that context. One thing that's held now for a whole new generation of young people, you can say, 4 years later, almost, is that younger folks are still having higher turnout rates. Not as big, but they're still significantly larger, yeah. If they're registered. And even the 18 to 24-year-olds who aren't using it as much, but those that register online are turning out more. And that's really interesting as well. So, yeah. More than those choosing to register another method. So the non-online, and I should have specified, is every other method combined. So.
Great, thank you, Mindy. We have another question here. We had one here, and then Ted, you'll be the last one, so we can conclude on time.
So just thinking about the future and seeing that 32% of individuals are not voting because of scheduling, are you guys doing any research about the day? In many other countries, people actually vote on the weekends so that more people can participate. Is there any thought about thinking, again, maybe we need to schedule our elections on another day?
That's not something that we've researched, but I think that the early voting provisions in SB 450 really do speak to that. And to Mindy's point about sort of distance and time and the calculations that a voter makes in their mind about whether or not they're going to vote, something that I failed to cover is that in Colorado, everyone gets mailed a ballot, but 71% of those people who are mailed a ballot actually choose to submit that in person. Now, 75% of those people who submit the ballot in person aren't going to a vote center. They're dropping it off at a 24-hour drop box or a drive-up location. Now, there's questions about whether that works in California when people have, language access needs or needs or different needs where they need more assistance. But I think by having 24-hour drop boxes and drive-up locations open on the weekends, on a Friday, on a Monday, it increases the number of options and the amount of time that voters have to submit their ballot.
Thank you. My question, Eric, is do you presume that everybody who's unregistered makes use of DMV in some way? And I think this is important. I know this morning it wasn't referenced that there is pressure to bring in TANF, ACA, and the other social programs. So my question to you, though, is are you presuming that everybody who's unregistered does use DMV in some way?
Well, the very aspirational number is about, well, what happens if we could register everybody who's unregistered, as a practical matter does, right? And that's why it's got to be very aspirational. I don't think we're going to hit that number. It's just to try and give a sense of sort of what are the magnitudes we're talking about. And I think when we get this thing together, we might play around with different assumptions in terms of the rate of uptake in that unregistered population. But otherwise, in terms of the rate at which new people are coming onto the rolls, we're not making any assumptions about the unregistered population. Instead, we're taking the population of people who are using the DMV and using their characteristics to try to estimate how many of them are unregistered. See what I'm saying? It's sort of it's turning the question on its head. Instead of saying like what share of the unregistered use the DMV, we're saying what share of the DMV users are unregistered, which in terms of the growth over time, that's the more relevant question.
Right there?
This question's for Mindy, and I feel kind of funny asking this because I conducted the focus groups with her, and so maybe I missed this or forgot this.
And we should clarify specifically the focus groups.
Yeah, the disability focus groups.
Disabilities, yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was a wonderful time spending 3 days locked in a room with people with Mindy.
And
so.
Ted was a fantastic liaison.
But
thank you.
when you talked about at the end here, after Rosalind's question, when you talked about the increased likelihood that youth voted if they had registered online, do we know if those younger voters registered online themselves, or were they at a place where someone was using a device, a tablet, at a festival or fair and registered them? So in other words, was there some sort of do we know from what the impetus was to get them to register to vote, whether it involved someone doing outreach to them and it just happened to be online, or they just themselves went, I'm 18, it's time to register to vote, and I have to vote?
Yeah, you've crystallized a key question for me as well. At this point, we don't know because the data that we have won't allow us to do that, but we want to do a little bit deeper dive and kind of work backwards. There are a lot of organizations that work with young people that use OVR like TurboVote and Rock the Vote, and we have data, of course, everybody has data through the NVRA and through Cover California, but hopefully we will be able to at least get some idea. But to be able to match up voter history is really difficult, so I'm not quite sure what we'll be able to do, but we're looking into it a little bit.
We do have time for
because the context matters. How you register, just like paper, matters. So.
I have a question over here, and the mic's coming. And we're going to really use our volunteer today. Any questions on this side? Okay, great.
Thank you. Two different issues. The chain of custody with these voting centers is really crucial, and I saw the film about the Colorado voter centers where anybody can bring in any number of absentee ballots and put them in the box. So, and then that connects to hacking. We're trusting all this online stuff, and we've had so much hacking, and voter registration lists taken, and we don't know whether they're changed. So I think the chain of custody and the potential for hacking these two issues are so central. This is the administration part of it.
Yeah, I mean, point well taken. I think that there are going to be significant technology challenges in terms of making sure that networks are secure, and people haven't really figured that out. So there are certainly people much more qualified than myself who are working on it. But I think that is something that obviously California is going to grapple with. In terms of the security that they have for, at least the way that it works in Colorado, is that for the drop boxes, they are deadbolted into concrete in the ground. And so there is a certain amount of security. Also, Colorado, in their law, there's conversations about whether this is feasible or not, or the right way to go, but they are under 24-hour surveillance in Colorado. So yeah, it's a camera. So that's an additional level of security that they've chosen. And the slot is such that you can only do one at a time. You're right that you could stand there and keep going, but again, the camera would catch that. And so you're right that there are going to be a lot of questions. I think that Colorado has been dealing with a lot of that, and so they do have some recommendations for how we might consider making those processes more secure.
Thank you. Before I wrap up the panel, I wanted to go ahead and give our panelists an opportunity to share with us the next stage of our research, of the research that they're working on, because I know it's something that we can continue watching as we know these policies are ongoing, and it'd be great to look back to these resources. So whoever would like to jump in?
Yeah, so Mindy and I have sort of 5 different stages total that we would like to ultimately do. 2 that we're working on sort of right now and kind of have definitely in the works, and then 3 that we're sort of thinking about. This one is just sort of phase 1, and then phase 2 is going to be a survey of registrars and advocates as we get closer to the rollout of the law, and then throughout the rollout of the law of AB 1461 to get a sense of how it's going and what issues are coming up. And then we would like to ultimately do a survey of people who are out of the registration rolls once people start being registered under this system, and register both people who are already or survey people who are already registered and people who are newly registered, and sort of see how those experiences differ, how they're feeling about the new system, that kind of thing. Then we'd like to have a couple of projects that look at outcomes, both in Oregon, once Oregon implements its system, and then in California, whenever California has its first elections under AB 1461, which probably would most likely a special election sometime in 2017 or 18 or something. But so that's a ways down the road, but be looking at some outcomes and see what the impact has been.
Great, thank you.
Great. The only thing I'll add there is we also have an advisory committee that we just established as part of the study. And phase 1 and phase 2 are funded by the James Irvine Foundation, and then phase 3 and 4 are still conditional, but we hope to be able to do 3, 4, and 5. Hope to be able to conduct those. And the advisory group, made up of a collection of advocates and bills authors and so forth, will guide us through that process, the whole process, hopefully. And then for the work that I've mentioned here on online voter registration and the California Voter Experience Study, as I mentioned on the CVE, California Voter Experience, it's a very large study and multiple methods. So we've worked through the focus group phase. That work is going to be coming out very soon. And then somewhat soon after that will be, what you'll see is the results of the statewide representative survey, which has an oversample of Latinos. And the focus groups the data is collected and informative in and of itself, but also has been invaluable in creating, and one of the reasons we waited on the survey was because we wanted the focus groups to inform the design of the survey, and boy, have they, in terms of changing even some of the questions that we initially thought we were going to ask and the ways we would ask them. And so the survey will be very much a product of what we've learned and is a product of what we've learned in the focus groups. But then we'll have some representative data. And then if folks are curious, because we have so many different groups that we're looking at, we'll be producing some research specific to voters with disabilities. And we're doing targeted surveys also with that community. Hello? Oh. Yep. And kind of taking different bites of the apple in our publications, and then eventually a full publication with everything combined. And then for OVR, I think I mentioned some of the phases in terms of the more of a causal analysis. And we're going to also we hadn't planned on doing this, but we'll be doing a survey for those of you that will be receiving it. A survey to ask the question. We know that a lot of groups are using it, but to be honest, I think the rate of use, at least in terms of the numbers that we've seen, are a little lower than maybe that we expected, and we would imagine some of you might have expected. And so we're wondering how many groups that are on the ground that do voter registration in communities with our young people and others, what are the methods that they're using? We're hearing anecdotally that paper is still being used a lot, but the best way to tackle that is to actually connect with all of you that are doing that work and do a survey and better understand the strategies and just who's doing what, but also the strategies around that and what all potentially are the barriers. If people aren't using OVR so much, is it a technology issue? Is it a resource issue? I don't want to presuppose things, but we'll be asking the question and learning from whatever those patterns are, what the reasons for those patterns. Does that make sense?
Great, and we're just about time, but I want to give it to
so
Eva.
I won't be around for the next phases, but the goal is to match the qualitative research that we've already done with a more quantitative analysis. So really looking at the data in Colorado to see demographic breakdowns of people who choose to vote in person, people who choose to submit their ballot by mail, whether it be USPS or a drop box or walking into a vote center, really breaking that out and figuring out, what does that look like for different types of communities across age, race and ethnicity, and a series of other demographics.
Great. So I want to thank our panel today for giving us a look into not just looking at the data, but really trying to take a pause and making sure that the reform policies that we've been looking at are reaching the folks that we want to reach and having the intended impact. So thank you all, and thank you to your audience for great presentation.